welcome to our webinar today on stress management in the workplace. We are just a little bit of housekeeping actually, is that if everybody who if you would like to ask any questions, please use the Q&A function that is available to you. One of my colleagues, Naomi, will be working behind the scenes to actually make sure that all of your questions do get answered. But if we do run out of time for any reason, then what will happen is we'll actually just get back to you at the end of the day. So just welcome to everybody today. Like I said, this is our stress management in the workplace webinar that we will be delivering for you today. Topics we're going to talk about are how we're actually looking at recognizing stress and the signs of stress in the workplace, what can trigger stress and how it can manifest itself. And that's really important because how it manifests itself can be different for every single person, and also so can the triggers of stress. What measures can we put in place to reduce stress? And then finally, we're going to be looking at how we can look to avoid the legal consequences and how we can look to avoid that impact on productivity that stress will have in the workplace. So a few introductions. For those of you who don't know me, I am Faye Bevington. I am the training manager here at Stallard Kane, but I also head up our wellbeing team, which is made up of about 8 members of staff. And we are a mixture of wellbeing champions and mental health first aiders. And what we actually look at is holistically the well-being for all of the staff here at Stallard Kane. So that's the people that are in the office with us, as well as those who work remotely. Also today, I'm going to be joined by our guest speaker, Andy, who is the director of We Are Wellbeing, who is a specialist expert in this field, as well as my colleague, Claudia, who is our senior HR advisor. So I'd like to pass over to Andy just to introduce himself to you all.
Hi everyone, so my name's Andy, so I'm the founding director of We Are Wellbeing. So my background is I trained as a physiologist, so if anybody's been for a health assessment before, I'm the kind of person you'd come and see. I do all these weird and wonderful assessments on you and give you some lifestyle recommendations based on what we've identified. So that was kind of the first half of my career. I now spend most of my time working with organisations looking at stress management, resilience and conversations around mental health.
And over to you, Claudia.
Hi everybody, good afternoon. So I'm Claudia. As Faye said, I am the Senior HR Advisor at Stallard Kane. So I oversee our HR team who are advising our clients on a day-to-day basis on a range of HR issues. Just one of those issues which has come to light, especially after the last 2 years and the pandemic that we've all been through, advising clients who are supporting employees through mental health struggles on a day-to-day basis.
That's lovely, thank you. So today, the way that the webinar is going to run is a very relaxed Q&A session. So I'm going to start by asking Andy some questions. So Andy, can you tell us a bit more, like what is stress? As I said earlier, it triggers different people in different ways and it can manifest itself differently. So you know, really what is stress? What are we looking at when we talk about stress?
Okay, so stress is a natural response to a dangerous situation. So stress is what we classify as the adverse reaction people have to excess pressure or other types of demand placed on them. And it arises when people worry that they can't cope. Now, where we find a lot of organizations and individuals struggle with stress is that we use the term far too flippantly. So like you're stressed, I'm stressed, the dog's stressed, everybody's stressed. But the issue that we've got is that, you know, whether it's a daily stressor, so, you know, I don't know, we've got a little bit too much workload on, we're a bit stressed, or we've got extreme debilitating stress, we refer to it all just as stress. So the issue that we often find in organizations is we're not using the terminology correctly. So when I think about stress, so let's say, for instance, look at sports psychology. One of the things we will look at, so one of the things I studied when I was younger at university, is this concept of what we call eustress. So eustress is optimum performance. So when an athlete goes in for it to do an event, they achieve eustress, and that allows them to run that 100 meters as fast as possible, break a world record, etc. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about the workplace. A lot of the times I'll come into an organization and, you know, I'll ask everybody, you know, is stress a good thing or a bad thing? Half the room think it's a good thing, half the room think it's a bad thing. So what we need to do is really understand and almost come together with a unified definition of what we mean by actual stress. So the HSE defines stress as the adverse reaction people have to excess pressure. So what that tells me is that pressure can be really good. Pressure can help us thrive and achieve, and we can help us develop personally and professionally. But when that pressure becomes excessive and it starts to have a negative impact on our physical and our mental health, that becomes stress. Now, inevitably, we will all experience some levels of stress at different points. We can't avoid it. But the difference is, if somebody's exposed to stress long term, that's the thing that's really going to become problematic. That's where we're going to start to see an impact on our physical and our mental health long term. So for me, stress is it's excess pressure.
Yeah. Okay. So leading on from that then, what would you say employers need to look out for as the key signs if they think that somebody's behaving out of character? What would be the things that they'd be like, oh, this could be actually a stress response that they're having?
So the list is as long as my arm when it comes to the signs and symptoms. So one of the things that we'll look at on training courses is sort of the physical, the emotional, the behavioral, the cognitive processes that are involved when somebody is experiencing stress. Like you said, it can manifest itself into anything. So it could be a lack of productivity. It could be somebody who goes within themselves. It could be that somebody that overcompensates. Somebody could become aggressive or tearful or emotional. It could be absolutely anything. So the challenge that organizations have got, imagine if you're a line manager and you're managing 10 different people, and all 10 of those individuals are going to express different signs and symptoms of stress. So that's the first challenge.
Yeah.
The second challenge is that they've all got different personalities. They're all going to express signs of stress differently, but also because of the stigma of experiencing stress or other mental ill health, then a lot of individuals will go to extreme lengths to try and hide it. So sitting back, hoping that you'll see the signs and symptoms doesn't work.
Yeah.
One of the things that we always encourage people to do, especially on when we do managers or champions training courses, is the value in asking this question. And the question is, when you're not coping, what does not coping look like? So I can tell you personally, I am an emotional eater. If I have a rubbish day at work, if I'm stressed, I'm straight on the chocolate.
Yes, I can relate.
Tesco Express, spend 5-6, cream eggs and mini eggs are getting consumed by the dozen at the minute. And that's me. So what you won't identify with me, you won't see me getting aggressive, you won't see me getting teary, you won't see me feeling a sense of dread or a loss of sense of humor. But what you will witness is me eating a shed load of chocolate. So I think one of the things that's really important for employers to do, so for line managers, is to go up to your team and ask them, when you're not coping, what does not coping look like? Because it gets rid of all that uncertainty.
Yeah. And just have that conversation, I guess, well before anything, is triggering you to think that they might be having some kind of episode or reaction to stress, but just being totally upfront and open from day one. This is how it looks for me when I am stressed and I'm in this situation. This is how you will watch my behavior change.
Absolutely. And it's about, so there's two things. There's one is, like we talked, the whole conversation about stress and mental health, as stress, anxiety, and depression often get bundled together when we look at stats and workplace trends.
Yeah.
But the fact is that if we're talking about stuff is great, but a lot of the issues that I'm seeing within organizations is we are talking more about mental health, which is great. But if you're only talking about mental ill health, if you're only talking about stress, anxiety, and depression, if you only talk about illness, you don't create a sense of wellness.
Yeah.
So if we are going to talk about stress, we need to talk about resilience. If we are going to talk about mental ill health, we need to talk about positive psychology and a growth mindset. You've got to get the balance right, because it's a little bit like learned helplessness and learned hopelessness. If you're consumed all the time just by talking about the signs and symptoms of stress, anxiety, and depression, you're going to talk yourself into a state of despair.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really key. It's a cultural piece, isn't it, really, now around that wider well-being and positive health, rather than just all the terminology and everything that comes along with only discussing mental ill health. And I think that shift is happening slowly.
It is, and I think a good example is like, so mental health first aid has been a really popular course, and rightly so, because we should be talking about it. But it's reactive. It's waiting for somebody to get ill, and then we can help them out. We can signpost them. We can have a conversation. But what we need to be doing is we need to be looking at this proactive approach. And the proactive approach is partly normalizing the conversation. So we know for a fact that most people who experience mental ill health or stress at work don't get any support whatsoever. So there's two main factors behind that. One is the fact that they don't have self-awareness. A lot of the struggle, and we go through, I've done it before where I've been struggling, I've not realized I'm struggling. So I think we need to develop a personal sense of wellness and self-awareness, which is fundamental. And then two is that if I go to my manager and I talk to my manager and say the fact that I'm struggling with stress and a workload's too much, I might inadvertently tell my manager that I can't do my job. So then there's this reluctance for employees to go to their manager and say that they're struggling. So what we need this culture where an individual employee can go to a manager, know that they can disclose that they're struggling without feeling like they're putting their jobs at risk. What we're seeing through things like the CIPD report is we're seeing that absenteeism's going up, which is, there's pros and cons to that. The fact that obviously, the numbers are increasing. So are people more stressed now than they used to be? Who knows? But then there's also the fact that leavism's going up. So, and presenteeism is going up. So people are more reluctant to take time off. So it has to be something that works all the way through the business. So it's cultural. It's like, what's the organization doing? What are they responsible for? What are senior leaders doing? What are line managers doing? What are your mental health first aids or your champions doing? But individual employees as well. If we don't push back and say that we're struggling, your manager doesn't know.
Yeah, it's so true. So true.
It's this, I feel like a broken record, but it's just about communication. When it comes to well-being at work, and this probably me being a bad salesman, but there's all these things you can invest in. There's tech, there's apps, there's all these platforms, but none of it has anywhere near the impact of just having better conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And a safe space in which you can have those conversations as well. I know a lot of employers now are kind of making, like an area where you can sit and it's very relaxing and you can just kind of, decompress a little bit from like your workstation as well. And I think that in itself is a massive shift I've seen over the last couple of years, really, is that that's just more commonplace now than it certainly ever was like 5 years ago. So I think things are changing, but I think that there's, like I say, a lot still to do around having those initial conversations right at the beginning before hopefully anything really too distressing manifests itself for people.
And I think that organizations need to just make sure that they don't get disheartened when things don't change too fast.
Yes,
you think if you've got an organization that's been going for 50 years, that culture is really well ingrained.
Yes.
And introducing notions around well-being and stress management support, it's not about changing the culture. It's just about, twisting the dial a little bit. It's about tweaking it and making sure that it's an organization where people can feel supported. But for me,
it's safe to have those conversations as well. I think that's the thing, like you said, without the the belief that there will be some kind of ramification or that people will think a certain way about you if you have these conversations, that is completely removed from like your elements of worry, and you can just have these really frank conversations with people.
Well, I think so a big part of this is, and there's a saying that says, your line manager is more important to your health than the family doctor.
Yeah.
Right. And it's this piece around that all of us, I stake my life on the fact that all of us at some point have had that manager who we can think of really fondly that was amazing. I think about one of my first ever managers when I was 17, he led by example. He wasn't the nicest guy, but you know what? He led by example and had a huge amount of respect for him. But I knew that if I was struggling with something, they'd support me.
Yeah.
So we've all got that manager in our work history that was brilliant, but we've all got the opposite as well. We've all got somebody that didn't care about our well-being, that was just about performance and KPIs and output. And unfortunately, so not all line managers are created equal. But most line managers have never had any support or training on how to look after the well-being of staff.
Yeah.
So, managers often become managers because they were good at what they did, not because they've got they don't necessarily have a load of empathy and understand how to have well-being conversations. But if they've never been trained to how to do it, we can't expect it. So that's part of the responsibility of organizations then, to make sure if you do have line managers, do they have the skills and practical tools to be able to support the well-being of their people? And then all of that stuff will start to happen naturally.
Exactly, and that's exactly, it's a natural progression from giving people the tools in which to just have these conversations in the first place, and then everything kind of, expands on from there. Just one final question for you, Andy, is do you have any practical advice that you could give to a manager that would then help support that individual?
Absolutely. So going back to what I was saying earlier about self-awareness, this thing about being able to recognize. So we use something like really simple, like the stress bucket mechanism. So the stress bucket is this idea that you've got all of these stresses coming in. So I might say, going into my stress bucket, I've got, if the kids, I've got 2 little girls, so kids, if it's workload, if it's commuting, if it's returning back to the office, if it's COVID, could be any of those things. And if all of those things are funneling into your bucket at once, so if I have a day where I've got a load of work on and the kids have been kicking off in the morning and whatever's happened, then the likelihood is that's going to fill my bucket, is going to overflow. So what I want to be able to do then is identify some holes in the bucket, and put some holes in the bucket are these, what we call these positive coping strategies. So not getting stressed and then going home and having half a bottle of wine, or, or being like me and being the emotional eater. Because every time you have a bad day, that's not productive. But identifying things that you can do on a daily basis that'll help you alleviate some of that stress and manage some of that stress. So for me, the outputs of my stress bucket would be exercise, be noticeably happier on a day that I do something for me. Bouts of mindfulness as well. So one of the things that we look at when it comes to stress management is a lot of us, we're rubbish at recovery. We might take rest time, but we're not resting with purpose. So a lot of individuals are laying in bed on a night thinking about work. Yeah. So they're not getting great sleep. So having strategies or strategic principles that allow us to switch off more effectively. So things like mindfulness breathing. It sounds a bit like woo-woo well-being, but one of the things I'll do something called 4-5-6, where I'll inhale for 4 seconds. If I'm stressed, I'll inhale for 4 seconds, I'll hold my breath for 5 seconds, and I'll exhale for 6 seconds. And then I'll repeat that over and over again, and only for a minute or two. And while I'm holding my breath, I'll think about how my heart rate feels. And while I'm doing all that, I'm so consumed, I can't multitask. So I'm counting, I'm thinking about my breathing, but by the time I've done all that, I'm not thinking about the thing that got me stressed.
Yeah. It's so key to have that kind of skill, isn't it? It really is.
A lot of people get put off with it by it because it's tied to things like meditation but it doesn't have to be something like that. It can be, another way I practice it, just going for a dog walk. Yeah. Middle of the day, leave my phone at home, and I'll just go for a dog walk. Something really, really simple. And that's just like lifting the clouds. So what I encourage everybody to do is complete a stress bucket, find those resources, whether it's been like mindfulness, whether it's exercise, whether it's talking, having open conversations, spending time with your mates. Yeah. Like for me, like well-being, it's not just about always doing these healthy traits all the time. If you need to have a bit of downtime, if you need to go to the pub with your mates and have a laugh, go to the pub with your mates and have a laugh. Yeah, we've got to think about the residual benefits of social well-being, not just always coming back to physical health, because sometimes the stuff that we do that's not necessarily amazing for physical health is actually really good for our overall well-being.
Yeah, and I think the social health concept is something that's obviously been so hampered in the last couple of years by everything that's happened. So I think that definitely, for me, I know that's a big reliever of stress in my life, is actually having those social interactions with people, and also just being outside. I find I get so much peace and calm, and I can be totally stressed and doing 100 things at once, but then actually, exactly like I said, I put my phone down and I'm outside, I'm walking, and it all just physically lifts off of me. And I think it's like I say, it's finding that thing that works for the individual, isn't it? And like I said, completing that stress bucket, it is a really good way, a really good exercise for individuals to carry out. Like, this is actually what I need. This is what it looks like for me as a person, rather than a one size fits all approach to it.
Yeah, and I think one of the key ones is a lot of pretty much every organization that we work with has, they've got HR, they've got an EAP, they've got an employee assistance program, they've got all of these resources. And a lot of them don't get used enough. And part of the reason why they don't get used enough is because individuals don't have self-awareness.
Yes.
You could be in the pit, you could be struggling like mad, but if you don't have self-awareness, you won't think you're struggling. So you won't phone the EAP, you won't speak to your manager, you won't go home and have a proper conversation with your partner because you don't recognize that you're struggling. So one of the things that we can really do with doing is helping people to develop self-awareness.
Yeah, and I think that's key. Like, and I think most people are really bad at that, just in every guise of their life. It's very hard to turn the mirror inwards, I think, and really take that time to look at yourself as an individual and be like, this is what I struggle with, this is what works for me, and this is what I need going forward. It's so much easier to look at other people and be like, oh, you should definitely do that, rather than focus on yourself. I think it becomes a very hard task, but one that's so important that we all strive to do. So thank you, Andy, for answering those questions for me. I'm going to move over to Claudia now. As Claudia introduced herself earlier, she is our senior HR advisor here at Stallard Kane. So Claudia, can you just talk us through the impact that stress can have from an HR perspective, please, in terms of productivity across the workforce?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really great what Andy just went through there, and we've heard a lot about how to identify stress and the tips and tools for managing stress, and really that emphasis on line managers communicating with staff and offering that support. But I really wanted to jump in from the HR point of view to say why it's so important that we do this. And just one of those reasons is the impact that having many staff suffering from stress, the impact that can have on your business performance. When you have an increased number of employees who are suffering from stress, and we all know that stress can lead to other mental health issues such as anxiety, depression, all of these conditions that unfortunately are on the rise, we know that individual will not be working to their full potential. And as a result, your overall workplace productivity is likely to drop. I actually read an article on people management a couple of weeks ago, and they'd conducted a survey on about 2,000 employees across the UK. And of those polled, they found over 2/3 of people are experiencing moderate to high levels of stress currently. So it's a huge issue.
Yeah, that's a really high statistic.
Yeah, and of those that were polled, a quarter of them actually admitted that their productivity had been negatively impacted in the last couple of years because of that stress that they were experiencing. So if you have staff who are feeling stressed, they're going to be tired, they're going to be fatigued, they could be in quite a negative mindset, and all of that is going to impact their levels of output and the quality of service that they are able to provide whilst representing your business. From a more practical HR perspective, when we're advising on these issues, we see on a weekly basis that when people are suffering from stress, it can lead to increased levels of lateness, staff absences. People are going to suffer from a lack of concentration, and it can also impact on their relationship with their colleagues. When you're looking at managing these things, that can often lead to misconduct issues. So you could have a higher level of disciplinary cases. It can lead to people putting grievances in against one another, which can lead to large-scale investigations. All of these things are super time-consuming, and they're really negative processes to have to go through as well. So if you can invest the time in looking after your staff and making sure they've got the support that they need, it's not only going to benefit that individual personally, but it's also going to benefit your business operation as a whole. And actually, by taking that time to do the supportive side of things and try to encourage those positive outcomes, it's going to save you time in the long run, because it's going to avoid a whole realm of HR issues that can happen as a result of stress in the first place.
Okay, so that's really great, Claudia. But in terms of, obviously, we've spoken about the motivation, the drop in productivity, and what that looks like, and what that long-term impact can have on the business. Can you just talk a little bit about what legislation actually underpins everything that we're talking about here today?
Yeah, definitely. So there are actually employment laws that govern this whole topic. And as an employer, you do actually have a legal duty to make sure that your staff do not suffer from undue stress at work. And also there's a legal obligation on employers to make sure that any employee who may be struggling has the support that they need to continue undertaking their job role. And all of that's underpinned by a piece of employment law, piece of legislation known as the Equality Act. It's a piece of legislation that came about in 2010, so this is nothing new. Hopefully most employers will have heard of this and be aware of their obligations under the Equality Act. But under that act, any employee who is struggling should not suffer any form of discrimination in relation to their condition. And the employer also has a duty to manage their condition fairly and reasonably. Most importantly, there's a huge obligation on employers to make sure that anybody who may be struggling, you have those conversations, you put support in place, you offer reasonable adjustments, and that's documented as well. And the whole aim of that should be with a view of discussing that employee's job duties, checking they feel well enough to undertake those in full capacity, and offering support to alleviate any difficulties they might be experiencing where you can.
And can I just ask on that, what kind of reasonable adjustments could an employer be potentially looking at? Would it be like a reduction of workload and shifting things about, maybe a reduction of time, things like that?
I think, like Andy said, how triggers of stress are going to be different for everybody. Actually, what's going to help that person is going to be completely different for everybody. So again, it would be a point of having that conversation and saying, what can we do to help you? What helps you to de-stress, but also looking at what the triggers are. So if they are triggered by an overwhelming volume of work, can we look at reorganizing some of your work? Can we reorganize some of your deadlines? Can we shuffle the work around the team to try and reduce that impact that workload's having on you? If it's a case of time, some people say, well, actually, it's a home issue. And in the morning, I'm really, really stressed to get myself out the door and manage everything I've got to manage. A lot of people are carers, or they have a lot of responsibilities at home that are difficult. Could adjusting their start time help, or adjusting their finish time help? So looking at flexible working options. For some people, it might be as simple as, you know, yes, I've got a lot of work on and I can cope with it, just as long as I've got enough rest during the day. So do they need a couple of extra breaks throughout their working day? And need to be there to make sure that they are taking those breaks and that we're encouraging those breaks, because it's all well and good saying you get an hour for lunch, but we've all been there where you've got so much work on that it's so tempting to just work through that hour to try and smash it.
Then reduces your productivity down and we're back in that same spiral. But I think the thing to take most from what you've just said there is actually getting everybody involved in that conversation. So the line manager and the employee actually sitting down and having a really, really good conversation about what would work for them, rather than and obviously it has to fit into the business model and how that would obviously work for the business as well. But having that two-way conversation, I think, is so vital when it comes to putting in these reasonable adjustments for people. And just one final question, Claudia, is what would be the risk legally to a company if actually they just failed to support a member of staff that was struggling in this way? What would that look like?
So if an employer failed to put support in place for somebody struggling from a mental health point of view, if they failed to recognise this as an issue and they didn't meet their obligations under the Equality Act, ultimately they're risking a potential employment tribunal claim. Now, some people think, why is that such a huge issue? Well, a tribunal claim and legal proceedings, first of all, are hugely costly. So I read a report the other week. I think the minimum at the moment for an employer to defend a tribunal claim, you're looking at a minimum of 10K. And that's before you even know if that individual is going to be successful in their claim and if there's going to be any additional compensation awarded. Aside from the cost, it's also a very time-consuming process to go through. And also, if that individual were to be successful, think of the impact that could have on your business's reputation, because the outcome of employment tribunals, they're all made public. Just to illustrate that example, there was actually a recent case that made national headlines in December just gone. It was the case of a Mr. Hardy who put in a tribunal claim against Topps Tiles. And in that case, he was actually successful in his claim for discrimination, which arose from his mental health disability after he was dismissed for alleged gross misconduct. A little bit of background quickly. I'll not go into the full ins and outs, but this was an employee who had an altercation with an angry customer. It led to a customer complaint that was investigated. He was invited to a disciplinary as a result of how he handled this customer. And he was dismissed at the end of that disciplinary hearing. He was found to have been guilty of gross misconduct. However, what his employer failed to take into account is that this is an individual who had been diagnosed with depression for over 20 years. So I know it's slightly different from the stress angle, but it just illustrates the same point. He had this diagnosis, he had suffered for a very long time, and he was classed as a disabled person under the Equality Act. Not only that, but the tribunal found that the employer should have known this individual was struggling and going through a difficult time. The evidence actually showed that he had broken down in tears just 5 weeks before this incident happened in a routine one-to-one with his line manager. And the tribunal found that his manager had absolutely no awareness of what ongoing support this person needed. So just a few weeks later, he then finds himself in a position where he's dealing with a really difficult customer. And he did actually say within his disciplinary meeting that his disability means that he finds it really difficult to manage his anger when he's responding to these types of triggers at work. But none of that had been taken into consideration by his employer at the time of his dismissal, and no support had been offered. So the employment tribunal judge actually found that not only had he been unfairly dismissed, but that his dismissal was classed as discriminatory under the Equality Act.
Wow, thank you for that. That's a really, really good example, actually. Like I say, not stress related, but all of the same context is in play there. So that's really good. Thank you. So just a few points from me next around training, which is something that Andy has obviously touched on, is that there are bespoke training packages available to help go through all of like the practical tools that you could offer your colleagues in your workforce. So this could be anything from looking at an EAP, so an employee assistance program. Like Andy said, there are lots of different options available to this, but actually making sure that individuals within the business are aware of what it is, what it can offer, and when they actually need to access these tools. I think that's a real key point. You can offer kind of resilience workshops, meditation workshops, whatever you think would look best within your business. There are lots and lots of options available. One of the apps that I've personally seen, it interacts with your staff on a daily basis, asks them a series of questions, morning, noon, and night. And depending on their responses back to the questions, if the app using its algorithms notices or thinks, inverted commas, that this person actually is in distress and they need to have a conversation, the app actually contacts the app provider, and a phone call is made to that member of staff proactively. So that member of staff isn't having to actually reach out themselves. It's done for them. So that's one option. They've also got your mental health first aid training, which is a 2-day course, and that looks at lots of different topics, from anything from eating disorders through to compulsive behaviours, anxiety, depression. But what that course is really giving you is the tools to have a conversation and then to signpost people on to experts within that field, whether that's the doctor or local groups or whatever that looks like. And the Wellbeing Champion, as Andy said, it's a much, much more holistic approach. You're looking at providing people with practical tools and resources to actually support well-being within the workplace. Like we've touched on, it's a cultural change, it's a cultural shift. Maybe change is too hard of a word, a cultural tweaking within the workplace as to, having safe environments to be able to have these conversations really openly and honestly with people. But again, that's a 1-day training course, and there's lots of different benefits to have to any of the options that are currently available. So just before we round up, I'd like to pass back to Andy and Claudia, just so that they could give just their top things for you to take away from today's webinar. So Andy, I'll pass to you first, if that's okay. So just some top tips for people to leave so it's fresh in their mind of, some active things that they can take away from today.
Absolutely. So I think the main thing is just going and having more conversations. One of the things that from a health awareness, mental health awareness, one of the things that has the biggest impact this piece around sharing real stories. So I could throw a load of stats at you, or I could talk to you about something that actually happened, and that's the thing that people remember. It's those stories of how we experienced something that was difficult and how we overcame it. So I think one of the things that you can do as an organisation is look at having like open forums where people could just have a conversation, a facilitation session. That's something that's really useful. But also the thing around making sure that line managers can have open and honest conversations with their teams. That's got to be fundamental, because otherwise people get missed out.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. Claudia?
Yeah, so from my perspective, it was just to back up everything that Andy's saying and talk about the reason why it's so important that those conversations take place, because not only is it going to benefit your individual employees on a personal level, but it's also going to benefit your organisation on a whole by A, making sure that you've met your legal obligations, and B, making sure that you can ensure the greatest level of productivity across your workforce. Only that, but by investing the time in having those discussions and putting support in place, it's going to help you to avoid a whole realm of other potential HR issues, which, believe me, are much more time consuming and costly to have to manage.
That's great, guys. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Andy. Really appreciate you taking the time today. Thank you to all of you for obviously tuning in to our webinar as well. So if you are interested in the stress bucket that Andy talked about earlier, we do actually have a lot of downloadable content on the Stallard Kane website. So you can go on, download it, have a look at it. Lots of other tools are around that you'll be able to access as well. If anybody would like to email me, I can pass any emails on to Andy and Claudia if there's any further questions. It's faye@skaltd.co.uk. The contact number is obviously there on the screen as well for anybody that wishes to contact us that way. If it's myself you want to speak to, it is option 3 once you ring that number. And it was just a reminder that Stallard Kane, obviously, we have been represented today on this webinar by the training department and the HR department, but we do also have other departments. We've got our health and safety offering, as well as our compliance offering. So if there's anything at all that we can assist you with, please don't hesitate to contact us and we will be happy to help you. And thank you again for taking the time today to come to our stress management webinar. Thank you.